The saying would go, every dietitian is a nutritionist, but not every nutritionist is a dietitian.
Welcome to another episode of the BHPN Podcast Series. My name is Dr. Nik Whyte, and I'm your host. And I'm joined here today with Terence Boateng, who is a registered dietitian working here in Toronto and in the GTA. Terence, good to have you today.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited for this.
Great. So tell us about what you're currently doing. You're our registered dietitian, and you are primarily based out of Toronto.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your current services and what you do?
Yeah. So I'm a registered dietitian, of course, and my practice is peak nutrition. So I do a number of different things, and I feel like I wear a lot of different hats. But my sort of core services, I would say I work with young professionals who are interested in either on the physique and sort of muscle and strength building side, or for people who are just really interested in longevity and preventative healthcare. So those are my main buckets, and I work a lot in sort of developing nutrition plans that people can actually utilize. And I emphasize that young professional bit because I find most people who work with me don't want like a long, complicated meal plan where they have to cook 100 recipes.
Okay.
So we stick to what are the clear things that are actionable.
Okay, so it sounds like your clients, they have busy lifestyle.
Definitely.
Maybe don't have a lot of time to do tons of grocery shopping, different recipes. And so you kind of cater and tailor things for what their needs are.
Absolutely. I think the fun thing I would say about being a dietitian is you get to blend the science with like the practical real life application. So I often find myself in the background, sure, doing calculations, figuring out calories, macronutrients, micronutrients, and getting these numbers, but then translating that into, okay, so what should I eat for breakfast?
Right.
What should I eat for lunch and dinner? And how can I do that in an efficient way? So a lot of the plans I make end up looking very different for different people.
Okay.
For some people, it's catering a meal delivery service where I say, hey, order this or this or this for lunch and this for dinner. For other people, it's cooking from scratch. So that's a lot of the fun of the job.
Right. So it sounds like it's important to know the client, know what they're going to do. It has to be sustainable, right?
Yep.
Like it doesn't make sense to tell someone to cook from scratch if that's not something that they're really going to be doing, right?
Absolutely.
So that must involve a lot of, getting to know your client, interviewing them, finding out sort of their cultural background, their preferences, all of that stuff, right?
Definitely. I think one of the advantages as being a registered dietitian as opposed to, say, family health practice is I have an hour often in my initial assessments. And that hour is actually a pretty dense hour. I always tell people a good 30 minutes is me asking you questions, me understanding your full health history, family history, but also can you cook? What do you like to eat? And how do we modify that? So yeah, that first session is really sort of deep and engaging, but it gives me the information that I feel like I need to put together something that a client can actually use to their benefit.
Great. Now, I want you to clarify for the audience that, there is a difference in Canada between a registered dietitian and a nutritionist. A lot of people don't know that. Can you tell us what the difference between the two are?
Yeah. I think the saying would go, every dietitian is a nutritionist, but not every nutritionist is a dietitian. So a registered dietitian is sort of a protected label. You have to sort of go through an accredited program in university. You're either doing an internship or a master's degree that's accredited to becoming a dietitian. And you're taught very specific skills, and you're also regulated by a college who's sort of overlooking your work. They have the right to access charting and make sure that you're doing the work appropriately. Whereas nutritionist is not a protected label.
Okay.
You're a personal trainer who gives you nutrition advice could arguably call themselves a nutritionist.
Yeah.
But there's nobody really regulating them. If they give you bad advice, as long as you don't hurt yourself, there's not really much you can do or in that regard. So those are, I think, the key difference.
Right. So there's no real recourse for people who don't agree with their nutritionist. And I like to say anyone can really be a nutritionist.
Yeah.
I'm a physician, but I'm also a nutritionist as well, right?
Exactly.
But I'm not a dietitian. That's a very distinct label. And especially in healthcare, you often have dietitians in the hospitals.
Yes.
Or in medical settings or in private settings as well. But I think it's important. It's a lot more work and more rigor and more oversight and ongoing educational requirements, I
Correct.
imagine, too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to stay up to date. There's always every few years jurisprudence exams that you have to retake. So I think the big difference is there's a lot of nutritionists out there who are great and
Yeah.
amazing at what they do. And there are a lot who have no idea what they're talking about.
Okay.
And sometimes without any sort of accreditation or titling, you don't necessarily know what you're getting as a sort of consumer who, you're obviously coming for nutrition advice because you don't know that much about the area.
Hmm.
And sometimes because of the lack of title, people can finesse you or give you information that's not quite accurate.
Right. And so would you say your practice is evidence-based?
Definitely, I really do focus on the evidence, but a lot of it is also translating that evidence into practice.
Into practice.
There's 100 things I could tell someone to do,
Yeah.
but if they leave my office with a list of here's 100 things you got to do to be healthy, most people aren't going to do all 100, right? So it's about finding the big low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And then for sure, there's people who are sort of higher up on the tree and they're doing the basics right, and then we're really getting into the smaller details.
Okay, that's great. So tell me about your childhood, your upbringing. Where are you from originally? Where did you go to school as a kid? And tell us about that.
Yeah. So I was born in Scarborough, in a little apartment complex called Teesdale, but my parents were able to move out of there probably when I was 4 or 5. So we moved from like the inner city all the way out to the suburbs in Whitby. And it was an interesting upbringing because coming from Scarborough, which was way more diverse, it was definitely more of an immigrant community, to at the time, I think I was the only Black kid, if not in my school, definitely in my grade.
Oh, really?
So it was, at the time, again, a much smaller town, much quieter community. And I think that's the first time I actually noticed, like, oh, I'm a little bit different from everybody. But in general, people were pretty welcoming and pretty nice, which was cool. Um, I went to a little cool school called St. Teresa, and I remember my parents were always extremely competitive for me. They wanted me to be the best, to do the best, to sort of achieve, and sort of that kind of classic kind of African upbringing, go be a doctor, go be a lawyer. I had all those speeches. And I remember it was probably when I was in high school, one of my aunts actually started getting sick. And it was sort of a bit of a paradigm shift for me because I was thinking about maybe becoming a pharmacist or doing that sort of world. But I realized a lot of the people around me, their only recourse to take control of their health was what medication should I be taking next?
Right.
And I felt a lot of the people in my family didn't take any agency over their health.
Okay.
And I honestly felt if I went into pharmacy, I might be, pushing that similar mentality in my family of like, hey, Terrence, you're a pharmacist. What should I be taking? So for me, that radical shift made me think, okay, maybe exercise science is the way forward. Maybe that's the way to be more preventative. And so I ended up going to University of Waterloo. I graduated in 2014, and I did a kin degree, and it was very enlightening. I'm also an exercise physiologist right now, sort of designated. But there, I remember it was in second or third year, we got to choose a minor. And I thought, okay, nutrition might pair really well with, exercise physiology, might be cool. And I fell in love with nutrition, like our nutrition 101, whatever the course was called. I really, really loved it. I loved some of the more scientific aspects of nutrition, but the practical piece. And a lot of our professors were actually dietitians.
Really? Okay.
So I was like, oh, like, what is this dietitian thing? Because I had never heard of it. I was like, is this just like a thing I can do after school?
Yeah.
And they gave me the bad news that I needed a whole separate degree to pursue that. So definitely more schooling after Waterloo.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. And you're from a Ghanaian background.
Definitely.
Were your parents were immigrants to Canada?
Yes.
Growing up, what was your diet like at home? Was it a Ghanaian type of cuisine or Canadian, or was there a mix, or what was that?
It's funny because it was definitely a mix. A lot of Ghanaian food, though.
Mm-hmm.
We would always make fun of my mom because she was really good at making Ghanaian food, which is often like soups and stews. But when it came to Canadian food, she had no idea what she was doing. I remember one night she was making us poutine, or what she thought was poutine. So we had some like frozen baked fries. She found some like pre-mixed gravy and she threw like a Kraft Singles cheese on it. And she's like, I think this is poutine. And we were like, Like, even as kids, we're like, this is a tough eat. So definitely a combination, but in our house, we definitely would push our mom to just stick with what she knew for sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting. I actually, my stepdad growing up was Ghanaian, so
Okay.
we would get our introduction to fufu,
Yeah.
jollof rice,
Yeah.
the whole 9 yards. And I remember all we wanted was McDonald's.
Yeah.
Hey, like we wanted to have what everyone else was having at
Mm.
school, but ironically, I've come full circle, and now I have a real appreciation for Ghanaian and African cuisine. And although I will say it is heavy on the carbs,
It is.
as you
It
probably
is.
know, and
It
so
is.
we do see in our communities, not just the African but Caribbean, Black community,
Mhm.
higher levels of diabetes, obesity.
Mhm.
Can you talk about that in terms of why do you think that happens? Is it purely genetic? Is it because they're coming and having a more sedentary lifestyle? Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, I definitely think it's multifactorial, and to the point of the diet piece. When people ask me like, "Oh, is this African or Caribbean or other diets healthy?" I would say that the diets that they were designed for made sense for a certain lifestyle at a certain point in time. If I was working in a farm all day or working out in the heat and doing hard, laborious work, I was actually in Ghana a couple of years ago and seeing some of the laborers work in the heat
Yeah.
all day. Would I tell that person that they should only be eating like salads and are they going to get enough calories or enough nutrients to do a hard day of physical labor? Absolutely not. And in that context, fufu and jollof rice might
Yeah.
might hit the spot.
Right.
But I think so. Part one, if you're transitioning to a much more sedentary office style job,
Yeah.
there isn't actually that much use for that much calories, that much carbohydrates, since we end up storing more fat and increasing rates of diabetes. So I think part of it for sure is diet and being able to sort of transition that diet to your actual lifestyle. And I think part of it for sure, we do see there's some genetic differences across many different communities, South Asians, Africans, Caribbeans. They're higher rates, but I think the way I think about genetics, it's almost like the software or maybe the hardware that you have inside of you,
Yeah.
but your actual experiences can dictate it. There's people who can be 100 pounds overweight, and I've seen this in my practice, and their blood work looks pretty decent actually. Their blood sugars are still totally normal.
Yeah.
I'll see somebody else who maybe work got really busy one year and they gained 10 pounds, and all of a sudden they're pre-diabetes and their doctor is really pushing them to make some changes. So I think our genetics can dictate how much of a leeway we have within certain health parameters, but ultimately lifestyle choices play a huge role in whether or not these conditions come up.
Absolutely, and I do agree with you. It's the function of the diet. In our current Western, lifestyle, sedentary lifestyle, we need to really be careful with things like carbohydrate intake, because that's going to push our calories up, and that's
Mhm.
why we see such high rates of obesity in Canada across all groups, right?
Yeah.
Compared to more developing countries where people are working and need those calories and those nutrients.
Right.
So, okay, so you grew up in Whitby, right?
Yes.
So you were, probably the only Black kid in your class. So you had to integrate. How was that? Like, what was that like? Number one, how did you overcome that being, and I'm sure at Waterloo that must have also been a similar experience. Can you
Mhm.
talk about your experience there?
Yeah, and even Waterloo felt like it went full circle. But I remember in Whitby, I feel like I was faced with more like questions and curiosity as opposed to sort of outright racism. For instance, I remember there was this one girl, I was probably in, I don't know, grade 3 or 4, and she came up to me and she said, "Oh, I learned in science class that like black absorbs more heat. So does that mean you feel like hotter than I do?" And I remember like thinking like, that's actually a good question. But also I have no idea. I've never been white, so I don't know
Right.
our heat differences, right? So I would get a lot of like interesting and strange questions like that. But in general, people were pretty welcoming. So I played sports growing up, so that I think helps, in the popularity sphere of
Yeah.
that. But then there would also always be a dark side as well. Like I would also have people, maybe they're watching things on TV and come up to me and say like, "Oh, like, is it cool if I like say the N word or call you that?" And I'd be like, "No." They'd
Right.
be like, "Oh, it's fine. Like I heard if you can give me a pass."
Yeah.
And so again, just being really definitely the only black guy in my grade, and there might have been one or two of us in the entire school, was quite different. By the in grade 8, we actually moved from Whitby to Ajax, which it's funny, it's just one city over, but way more diverse.
Right.
And even that was interesting, having spent like 7 years in Whitby and then come back to Ajax. I definitely felt more comfortable, a lot more Africans, a lot more Caribbeans, Filipinos, whites. Like it was just a really diverse school at Notre Dame is where I went. But then going back to Waterloo, like you said, it was sort of similar. I went from this super diverse place to Waterloo. The demographics were mostly, I would say, like either white or international students.
Okay.
That was mostly it. So most of our, like I had a number of Chinese friends, but they would have been from Hong Kong or mainland. And I had a number of South Asian friends, but again, they would have just come to school for that, and that would have been their experience of Canada.
Okay.
So I feel like I've been in a lot of different kind of environments now that I've sort of gone through that.
Yeah. But having grown up in Canada your whole life around Canadians, I mean, I assume like like I do, you identify as Canadian, right?
Definitely.
And I think sometimes people, when they look at you, especially even if you're traveling and you
Yeah.
say, "Hey, I'm Canadian," they might say, "No, like where are you really from?" Right?
Yeah.
That type of questioning we get, and maybe it's genuine curiosity, or it could be ignorance, but it's something you have to deal with, and you learn to kind of accept and not judge people for it as best you can, right?
Definitely. Yeah.
Great. So after your undergrad at Waterloo, you then went on to Toronto Metropolitan University or Ryerson University. What was that like, and what did you study there exactly?
Yeah, so they had a sort of human nutrition program well, it was Ryerson at the time, TMU now, and I actually really liked the program. There were certain elements I really enjoyed, and then there were other elements that I was like, oh, this isn't exactly what I want to do in my professional life, but I still enjoyed it. I actually remember, having gone through kin and doing a minor in nutrition and really loving it. I remember the first day I walked into class, I hit a bit of a culture shock because I walked in and I looked around and I was like, oh, there's only women in my class. And I was like, it hadn't even crossed my mind that nutrition might be a more like female dominated sort of environment. But I sort of looked around and I'm like, I guess that makes sense. But I always thought of it much more as like, a hardcore science as opposed to some of the practical elements. So, either way, going through it, I really enjoyed those classes.
Mhm.
I would say the program itself was maybe 50% nutrition science and really 50% a lot more of the social sciences, which I think in hindsight makes sense in figuring out eating in higher environments and cultural contexts and that sort of thing, as well as public health and government regulation. So it's a bit of 50-50 for both.
Okay.
But that was really the undergraduate experience.
Got it. And then when did you went on to do a master's,
Yes.
correct? Was that also at TMU?
Yes, definitely. So I chose, because there is an internship option that dietitians can do if they want to be accredited. But TMU had this Master's of Health Science in Nutrition Communication.
Okay.
And it was actually really, I would say, geared towards people who wanted a more unique sort of professional development.
Mhm.
So the classic internship would have been in a hospital. You'd be there for about a year. You'd be going through, the GI ward, the renal ward. You'd be doing these specific educations and lots of value, I think, if you want to be a clinical dietitian in a hospital.
Mhm.
But I had always sort of felt more entrepreneurial and knew that that's what I eventually wanted to do. So this sort of MHSC program made the most sense.
Okay.
So yeah, it was about 8 months of like in-class work, but some of it would have been self-directed in terms of a lot of projects you could do. I did a lot of sports nutrition presentations through school, for instance. And then the second 8 months was an internship as well. But we got to, in connection with the school, design our own internship and work with different professionals. So I got to work with actually a lot of private practice dietitians, even when I was in school, which was just amazing for what I ultimately ended up
Good
doing.
exposure, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I will say that the majority of nutritionists that I encounter or have encountered in my career have been in hospital settings.
Yep.
Can you tell the audience what a nutritionist in the hospital does? Like what types of tasks, roles, responsibilities you would have in a hospital setting?
Yeah, definitely. And I can speak from experience because after school, even though I started my practice right away, I actually worked part-time at St. Michael's in the GI ward. So
Okay.
it's the day is set up, I think, similar to many other health practitioners. So you sort of start the day in this big meeting with other doctors and health professionals, going through the patients, on the unit, and sort of deciding based on sort of a hierarchy who you should be seeing for nutrition related conditions.
Okay.
And every unit's going to be different in terms of who they prioritize, because in our current healthcare system, there's no way you as a dietitian are going to see every patient in a unit.
Yeah.
So you sort of prioritize based on their conditions, based on if they're losing weight or having issues with the food, or are having some serious nutrition related conditions. You set that up, you read through their charts, and then you have conversations with them to figure out, how can we optimize your stay? How can we adjust your diet if you need to be on a low sodium or low potassium? You're sort of crafting their diet based on their condition.
Yeah.
But then also in most dietitians unit, you're encouraging people to eat so they can maintain their strength to go through surgeries, to shorten their hospital stay after recovery. So it's a lot of very acute, really focused work, as opposed to where I think most people think of nutrition is a much more broader context. Is how do I eat to live and to enjoy and to maintain my longevity. This was very dialed
focused.
in.
So, an example might be you have a patient who is in the hospital for the Crohn's flare-up, right?
Yep.
And they're having an issue in hospital, and you're trying to cater an actual hospital diet, number one, and then also number two, give them some education so when they go home, they're not right back in the hospital a few weeks later. Right?
Exactly.
And that's important, I will say, because, I do hospitalist work. We don't have time as the doctor to sit there and educate the patient on that aspect. And that's really the key for many GI conditions.
Absolutely.
I recall recently I saw a patient in the emergency room who had a history of scleroderma with Crest syndrome, which is pretty rare. And I was trying to educate the patient and his wife about the importance of following the diet, avoiding, protein, like certain proteins, for example, which might be fine for you and I to eat steak, but for this patient, it was life or death because he was getting recurrent small bowel obstructions, right? So that part, it can keep people out of the hospital, the nutrition. It can save their lives, and it can really prevent further deterioration of some of these conditions.
Absolutely.
But that being said, it is very focused, right? It is very medical, whereas what you do now in the community, it sounds like, is a lot more preventative and holistic. Can you talk about the difference there?
Yeah, and it's in part why I always knew this is what I wanted to do. I figured if I was only working in a hospital, I'd feel a little disillusioned only seeing people, especially if it's a nutrition related condition, at the end stage where there's not as much we can do.
Right.
I think in my practice now, while I do definitely see people with prediabetes or even diabetes, or maybe their cholesterol is just slightly above of the mark, a lot of the work I do is in perfectly healthy people. But if I were to put a number on it, 20-30% of my patients are actually coming in because they're like, hey, my dad has diabetes now, or my dad has uncontrolled hypertension or congestive heart failure. My grandpa also had this issue, and how can I stem this? What should I be doing lifestyle wise to ensure that I can sort of have a longer health span?
Right.
And so a lot of it is more holistic. There's pros and cons to that. I think the big pro is I have a lot of time to work with people. I've worked with people over months, over years, and really there's not an urgency that they need to change their diet today or they need to change everything that they're eating today, but we can nibble at it one piece at a time. So I really do like doing that work. I think one of the cons though is for some people, I use my own term. It's not a real term, but I call it like the traumatic theory of change, where I think some people need something very serious to happen to them to actually make health changes. And so I do definitely, unfortunately, see some clients who are healthy. Maybe they felt motivated one week and wanted to book in to see a dietitian, but after that week's motivation, they sort of fall back into old habits because it's not really top of mind. So some of my work, I'm also thinking of how do I work with people who clearly want to make change. They're booking in to have conversations with me, but they're a bit wishy-washy in how much change they realistically want to make.
Okay. Can you tell us, in terms of the clients you're seeing, the patients you're seeing, what are the most common problems that you see when someone comes in? What is the issue? Is it that they're eating too much, they're snacking? What is it that you're doing? What are the common things that the changes you're making?
Yeah, I would say step one, even without being in the core sort of nutrition science, people actually often have no idea what they eat. I think people have an idealized version of what they eat, but there's a common joke among dietitians where if I ask someone what they ate yesterday, I would say 80% of the people I work with will say, "Oh, yesterday was a bad day, but this is what I ate." And so one of the common things I think is, like I said, people don't know what they're eating, but people don't really have a structure to their day.
Okay.
It's like, oh, what did you eat for breakfast? And it's like, did I have a breakfast? Do I have a breakfast?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are just sort of falling over themselves, eating when they can, and then not really putting as much care into that.
Okay.
So I'd say that's the first issue. I think the second issue is the two extremes would be, I would call them the constant grazers who, every time their blood sugar gets a little bit low, they find themselves getting up, grabbing a cookie. Maybe they want to be healthy, they grab an apple, but they're sort of grazing all day on, I would say calorically dense, carbohydrate dense foods that aren't particularly satiating.
Right.
And so they way overeat because they end up just grazing all day. On the far other end of the spectrum, I have my sort of overly large meal eaters. Well, they'll have a light breakfast. They'll go until like 3 or 4 p.m. not thinking about food, wondering why they're feeling low energy and miserable. And then, some dietitian tells them they're supposed to be eating this nice, cute, healthy meal, but by 3 o'clock, they're like, and they find themselves at the fast food place or just way overshooting the mark in terms of their intake. And I think when you're in that frame of mind, it is hard to just have a healthy meal when you're starving yourself. So a lot of it actually is practical as opposed to, everyone coming to me with diabetes or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some people have no plan.
Yes.
Really is something I always see. I'm like, well, oh, I went to McDonald's. Well, why did you go to McDonald's? Oh, I didn't bring a lunch today. Well, what do you think's going to happen?
Exactly.
Right? So practically speaking, what are some of the tools that you are using or telling people to do to make those small changes to become more aware of what they're doing?
Yeah. So the first thing I tell people is I have this sort of categorization in my mind of fun food and functional food.
Okay.
And I don't necessarily have an issue with someone wanting to have fun, but I'll give you an example. When I was a bachelor living on my own, I actually ate really healthy and didn't really have a lot of junk. And I think if someone had spoken to me back then, I might have said, oh, you got to be more disciplined. You got to XYZ. I would have had my whole spiel. I remember when my fiance, now wife, moved in, she brought her sweets, and I found myself nibbling every day. A little chocolate here, a little ice cream there. And what it taught me is either one, I was way less disciplined than I thought. And two, the way I was eating or avoiding some of these foods consistently was I just had an environment where it didn't come to mind. It wasn't in my fridge. It wasn't in my cabinet, so I wasn't eating it.
Right.
So the discussion my wife and I had, and often the discussion I have with my clients is, okay, if this food is supposed to be fun food, if cookies and cakes are supposed to be celebratory meals, how can we put them in line for celebrations, for going out, for date night? I never have an issue with someone wanting a latte and a cookie on a Sunday morning.
Right.
But you have that cookie at that cafe, you enjoy it, and you've had your time. You've really maximized that fun.
All right.
My issue is, having that row of cookies and then telling yourself, don't eat it, and then kind of wagging your finger at yourself. It just doesn't make sense.
Okay.
So I would say one of the big tips and tricks is I make that separation of functional and fun food.
Yeah.
And I tell people, have fun. We'll talk about how much fun is appropriate. But then if you're just eating to eat, to get through your day, to have a healthy dinner, here's how we can make it functional and still taste good.
So maybe it's like, when you have your grocery shopping, you've got your healthy, your functional food.
Yeah.
And if you want to go for that treat, you go to the cafe, you
Yes.
have the cookie there.
Yes.
But it doesn't come home with you, so it's not right in front of your face, right?
Absolutely. I always say, like, these aren't the foods that should be your leftovers. Like,
Okay.
go enjoy, go to
Get rid of it, right?
Yeah, go get, if there's a birthday party, you can have your slice of cake, but you shouldn't be bringing home the cake. You shouldn't be having a whole row of Oreos just sitting in your cabinet. That, I think, is just breeding an environment where you're not going to be successful.
Now, I'm curious to know, do you use any type of self-monitoring for patients, like calorie counting or apps or any tracking, anything like that?
So yes, because of the sort of pretty wide array of patients I see, I don't have one specific tool I use for everyone. Because if I have an older client, for example, who doesn't want to track or use a MyFitnessPal or an Excel sheet, then I won't force them to use that. And for some of those clients, we actually, especially my older clients, use pen and paper and just, okay, write down what you're eating so that I have an idea over the next 7 weeks.
Okay.
For other clients who are more sort of technically skilled,
Mhm.
yeah, now I don't have any personal favorites, but I'm often using like MacroFactor or MyFitnessPal so that they can track what they're eating to the portions. We can get all the calorie and macronutrient metrics, and then use that to tailor it. Because at the end of the day, the calculations that we do as dietitians are in part based on averages, right? Yeah, I know your age, your height, your sex, your physical activity. I know, but you can take two people with those same metrics and they may burn different amounts of calories.
Okay.
So ultimately, I'm giving these numbers and I'm providing these portions, but then they're executing it, giving me the output, and then we're tweaking based on the results.
Right.
So I do definitely have a more scientific mind and like sort of that technical analysis, but also realizing that a good percentage of my clients just aren't there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of my favorite clients I often are like engineers who just see themselves as like, I am the robot. You tell me what inputs I need and we'll see the outputs.
Yeah, that is a really kind of easy way to do it, right? Because it's all accurate. You've got the data. You can follow the data, right?
Absolutely.
But not everyone's going to do that.
No.
And it doesn't work to force someone to do something that they're not going to do, right?
Yeah.
We need sustainability in these diet plans, and we need something that people are going to be able to do, not just for a year, but maybe for the rest of their lives, right?
I agree. And so for some of my technical clients, for example, we actually have food scales and all of that. But for a lot of my clients, I send them like a hand serving guide where I'll tell them, okay, a cup is roughly a fist, 3 ounces is this much, and they can just use visual representations. So I think I have a lot of different tools I use, but it's finding the right tool for the right client.
Okay, well, that's great. So, you're an entrepreneur, you're a business owner. Did you know that that's what you were getting yourself into when you were becoming a registered dietitian? And talk about if you had any education, your formal education, was there any discussions about things like personal finance, business, entrepreneurship?
Right. Yeah. So one, it is something that I knew I wanted to do going into TMU, but I think that in part was fostered at the University of Waterloo because a lot of people in that kin program were either going into physio or chiro. Some were going to med school as well. But both, I think, physiotherapy and chiro is a little bit more entrepreneurial in sort of culture. And so, I always thought, oh, yeah, I'm going to be a dietitian. I might work for someone for a bit and then start my own thing. And then that's where my head was at. So it was quite actually shocking when I got to school and the vast majority of the people I was there with wanted to work in the hospital or wanted to work in a, community practice or for public health. So I think because that was the orientation of most of my sort of colleagues, there was very little education on entrepreneurship. For whatever reason, they wanted us to take an accounting class. So I actually find that extremely helpful. So we did do that. I think I electively took like a marketing 101 sort of basics class. But in terms of formal education in business, that would be about it. Of course, there's been a lot of education since then and a lot of different hats to wear and a lot of sort of, hey, I don't really know much about this specific thing. Where can I find access to that? Where can I get that information?
Okay.
Yeah.
So in your current business, it sounds like you have to do it all. You have to recruit clients, market yourself, do your books,
Yes.
manage your insurance, things of that nature. Talk about what that's like as a practitioner. That can you explain to people what is required for you to keep your business up and running and to grow it and scale it and all of those things?
Yeah. I would say the first thing, just on the more mentality side, I think you need, if you want to go into entrepreneurship, I think you need to be somebody who's willing to ask questions, figure out answers, and sort of problem solve and have some level of confidence. And I'll give you a quick example. I knew that obviously dietitians can bill through insurance, or at least many clients can get reimbursed through their own kind of health benefits. So I remember sitting there being like, okay, I'm ready to start my practice. I'm ready to see people. How do I know like what an invoice should look like so that, Manulife or whoever will cover it?
Yeah.
So I actually just was like, well, why don't I just call Manulife and ask them what they need on their insurance? And so, I'd make a phone call. Yeah, we need to know the location, your registered dietitian number, all the different parameters. And I think you have to have that mentality of like, if you don't know, ask and then be confident. But I remember the very first time I made my full invoice as beautiful as possible, gave it to my client, they paid directly, and then word for reimbursement. I was like, yeah, let me know if there's any issues. Let me know if you don't get covered, just so
Yeah.
I know. And then I emailed them a couple of days later and like, yeah, all good. Things are covered. And then they're like, hey, cool, set. So I think the first part is having the mentality of knowing like, hey, there's not necessarily a textbook there
Yeah.
that's going to tell you everything that you need to be a registered dietitian in business, but you're going to have to figure this out. I think today how that shapes up is I would thankfully still say 50+% of my time is spent doing just core dietitian work, working with clients,
Okay.
building meal plans, having those discussions, which I love. Um, and but that also leaves another 50% for admin, billing, marketing, deep thinking on where I want to go with my business. And that's not necessarily, again, been trained into me, but something that I've had to learn to do if I want to grow and expand.
Wow. Okay. And well, so of course, knowing how to get your services covered by insurance is critical.
Absolutely.
As a registered dietitian, I know that most insurers will have more coverage, right, in
Right.
comparison to, say, a nutritionist. You mentioned that you have some corporate clients.
Yes.
Can you tell us how you were able to get corporate clients? And is that also done through insurance? Like, do you approach them and say, "Hey, everyone here has coverage. Why don't we do a unique program?" Talk about that.
Yeah. So, first I'll break down my services. So with corporations, I have three broad services that I offer. One is sort of workshops and seminars. So I've done workshops, for example, on, making a healthy breakfast, for example, or healthy breakfasts on the go. And I'll literally bring in like overnight oats or like some sort of recipe that we're making together in a workshop, breaking down some of the science. And that's been a really fun aspect of it. And I'll go in for an hour and do that. The second is sort of similar to what you're describing is dietitian day, where I can approach and say, hey, you guys all have benefits, why don't I come in for a day, sit there for 8 hours, see 8, 9, 10 of you, build out some plans, and everything's covered for you, and we build that in. And anyone who's interested, it's sort of a great offering. And then the third is more Actually Nutrition challenges, which is a lot of fun. So a lot of companies reach out maybe in a January or some month where they're feeling motivated, and I'll actually sort of design recipes for breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks for an entire month, and they would get a certain number of points for every meal that they end up making on a particular day. And there's a prize pool at the end for whoever made the most recipes over the course of that month. So those are sort of the three offerings. But in terms of, I remember my very first one, which was ultimately through Cadillac Fairview. They actually just cold reached out to me.
Really?
Yeah, I have some of my services listed on a few different websites and marketing channels. And they reached out to me saying like, hey, we saw your profile. We're looking for someone to do this particular wellness workshop. I forget the first one I did for them. I think it was actually how to eat to maintain better energy levels through the day, something in that field. So I went, I did that, did a really good job, and that's in part thanks to my nutrition communications masters. We did so many presentations that I went in feeling very confident, even though it was such a big company. Did well there, and then they've sort of kept picking me up for more and more stuff. I have a Manulife presentation in October, which should be really exciting, and it's sort of that initial. I think a lot of life is like being fully prepared. The opportunity comes up, you execute on that opportunity, and then word of mouth and other ways of kind of getting your message out, it sort of snowballs from there.
Well, that's great, and that's great to hear. And I think for many people who are in, either aspiring to become dietitians or nutritionists or other allied healthcare professionals, getting in front of a group is often a good way to
Yeah,
expand your services rapidly, right?
absolutely.
Rather than just the one-on-one clientele. So it
Absolutely.
sounds like having a mix of that plus your individual services is important to your business.
Absolutely, absolutely. One feeds into the other, and I think often because of all of these like Cadillac Fairview presentations I've done, like my main office is actually right in the downtown core financial district
Okay.
because now that's where a lot of my clients are coming
Okay.
from, and taking their lunch hour, skipping out from work an hour early to come and see me. That's often where I'm seeing most people now.
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you about longevity because this is a growing space, I
Mhm.
find, and there's a lot of information out there on social media, a
Mhm.
lot of influencers talking about longevity, supplements, nutrition, lifestyle. That's something you do as well.
Right.
So, can you tell us what is longevity, like as a general concept, and how do you try to help individuals with that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think first, if I were to sort of define longevity, I'm going to contrast maybe two terms like health span versus lifespan. So lifespan might be broadly defined as just how long do you live.
Right.
And I think in general, medicine has been really good at extending lifespans, having medications to kind of keep people going and keep people alive. Health span then might be defined as how many years of life do you have where you're healthy and able to do the things that you want to do.
Okay.
And that is a very different question. I think many people, for example, can live, maybe hit 55,
Hmm.
get diabetes, but with good management can still live well into their 80s if it's managed well. But they have to make a lot of changes.
Hmm.
So their health span might have only been 55 then, because that's when they ended up getting diabetes. So a lot of my work is in extending that health span. And I love it. I have a little a service that I do where this is a lot less about designing, say, a meal plan for someone,
Okay.
and instead it's going through a lot of the different evidence on specific parameters. So, for example, I have a 4-session package that I work with clients where the first session is that initial assessment and really just understanding their background and why they're concerned about it.
Yeah.
But then we go through an entire sort of discussion just on the role that muscle plays in longevity and what are the dietary plans and recommendations involved in maintaining muscle mass over time, bone density and how we sort of maintain bone density. And, I work with DEXA scans as well to kind of have some measurements on where they currently are at. I have a series that if I'm working one-on-one with someone on metabolic health and what are the recommendations for diabetes prevention, cholesterol prevention, hypertension management, all of that. So it's a bit of a longevity series where we go through these very specific things. And I have a third one where we touch on some of the more evidence-based supplements, when they can be used, when they might not make sense, and kind of developing a bit of a personalized protocol for that person.
That's interesting. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on intermittent fasting or fasting in general. What are your thoughts? What does the science show?
Yeah.
Do you use that? Do you believe in it? What do you do with that?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a very quick summary of the evidence as I've seen it. And I definitely haven't read everything out there, to be fair, but a lot of the initial buzz on intermittent fasting came from animal-based studies,
Hmm.
and some of the earlier ones, they would find first of all that certain animals within the same species, if they fed them less calories, they would live for longer, which is sort of an interesting finding.
Hmm.
And so some of the researchers then would do a bunch of different protocols to figure out how do we get this life extension with diet. So some of the early research, and I remember this even back in school, was alternate day feeding, which
Yeah.
is obviously much more extreme than most people do intermittent fasting. So you feed an animal for one day, no food for the next day, on and on and on. And yeah, they found that those animals would live longer, which was sort of interesting. Um, then from there, I think the research evolved to what are called natural experiments, where we could just look at populations who might be naturally fasting and seeing are there changes in health outcomes.
Hmm.
So there might be, and there was quite a bit of studying on Ramadan fasting and measuring factors before and after the fast, as well as Jehovah's Witness, have their own sort of fasting protocols that they do, and some good benefits.
Hmm.
And I think as you read the research, it's become clear that there are definitely some benefits to fasting. It's not 100% clear how much of it is sort of reducing people's calories and helping them with body weight versus some other parameters, but I think there is enough evidence to suggest that there's some benefit to the fasting in and of itself.
Hmm.
However, the caveat I would give is these research-based benefits are not the 8-16 fasts that people do. I think those fasts are in the purview of a potential tool to help people manage their body weight,
Yeah.
but the actual bigger health parameters are much more aggressive fast than that. We're talking 24-hour fasting, which can have its pros and cons even within navigating that.
Yeah.
So I do use some fasting as a tool. I use some fasting myself for clients who, for example, are like, hey, I'm not a breakfast eater. I'm not going to force you to breakfast. Let's figure out a healthy eating pattern between 12 and 8. Sure, let's do it within that. And I think having clear rules is super helpful for some people.
Yeah.
But the evidence-based fasting and putting people through 24-hour fasts, it's not something I do because I am worried that some people are going to take it too far and hurt themselves.
Yeah.
Even if it's something I do every once in a while myself personally.
Yeah, I agree. The evidence really just shows that it's more from the caloric restriction that happens with the fast. It's maybe a little easier for some people to manage those rules. Hey, I can only eat from 12 to 6, right? And that's where they're able to control it and eliminate snacking.
Yeah.
But as far as we can tell, there's no inherent benefit from fasting other than that. But you did mention the 24, the sort of alternate day fasts. There shows some benefit in diabetic patients and other things like that, but I think it's gotten a lot of hype, and I'm glad that we're on the same page. It's not the be-all, end-all, and there's so many ways that we can do this, right, with nutrition. I think fundamentally a lot of the studies show that any diet can work, right?
Very true.
It can be low carb, it can be high carb, plant-based. It just depends on the individual. It depends on, a number of factors in their lifestyle. So that is a really good point. So Terence, you're also an exercise physiologist. So that means you're able to also talk with clients about exercise routines and give them some advice in that area. Tell us about how that ties into your practice.
Yeah. So, I'm an exercise physiologist, and I started that sort of path through Waterloo when I was doing my KIN program. So it's also a regulated health professional, regulated through the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology. What's interesting about being a CEP is what they call it. You can both work with everyone from athletes, but they also give you a lot of education on specific health outcomes. So how do you train someone who has diabetes or hypertension or more severe heart-related conditions?
Okay.
So a lot of the education was in there. How it fits in my current practice, though, I don't necessarily write programs for people anymore, just because it's a lot of work to both be their personal trainer, for example, and be their dietitian and go to them to the like it's too much. So I tend to refer outwards.
Okay.
But what I often actually use it for is one, in my communication with athletes, because I can understand the programs. I can speak to marathon training and periodization, not just from a nutrition science perspective, but from having actually learned the physiology, understanding, VO2 max and muscle fiber types and all of that. So that it's great for that. I think the other time I use it often, honestly, is in critiquing and adjusting people's plans.
Okay.
So someone's not working with a personal trainer, but they're working out. I go, okay, like, what are you doing in the gym? Like, give me a breakdown. I understand your goal is to build muscle. And if there's because I have an understanding, I can give them the core principles without necessarily saying you need to bench press on Monday, you need to do this on Tuesday. So that's really how I use it.
So understanding the language of an athlete, a bodybuilder, a endurance athlete, you kind of know the differences, the terminology, you're able to really get into the nitty gritty with those clients.
Absolutely.
Right?
Exactly.
And what types of teams are you working with currently?
Yeah, so most of the teams I work with are sort of club teams. So a lot of I've worked with like the gymnastics club in Burlington. I've worked with a lot of soccer clubs actually on the West End here, all the way through to Scarborough and beyond. So it's a lot of actually gymnastics, soccer, and a number of hockey teams as well.
Okay.
Most of the work I do with them are sort of in the off season. We might put on sort of nutrition workshops and presentations. So, okay, I'm in the off season. Maybe I want to build muscle. How do I kind of put together a program and a discussion so that a group of athletes can learn how they should be eating as opposed to one-on-one work? And then, of course, anyone who wants to work one-on-one absolutely can reach out.
Okay.
I remember one fun program I did, especially almost immediately after sort of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of athletes were totally out of shape, and teams would bring me in and say, hey, these kids haven't played any sports for a year, 2 years. We need to get them on a nutrition plan. Maybe some of them have gained excess amounts of weights because they've been eating like athletes but not training anymore. They brought me in to help them kind of whip them back into shape on the food side.
Okay. Now, as a Black dietitian,
Mhm.
can you talk about what's that like? Do you get clients who do want your services, like Black patients who want someone who maybe looks like them? Have you experienced that at all? And also, were there any challenges in your educational, process of getting to where you are today because of your skin color?
Yeah, I would say for on the client side, definitely a bunch of my clients are coming to me specifically because I'm Black or specifically because I'm Ghanaian. If we get more granular sometimes, and I think a big part of food that's a little bit different from say medicine is there can be a broader range of medications that can work on a bunch of different people, but
Hmm.
there's definitely people who are coming and saying, "Hey, I don't want to go to say, the classic stereotypical sort of white lady dietitian because she's not going to understand any of my food or how I eat or the context." So versus if I have a Ghanaian client who says, "Hey, how can I incorporate jollof rice? What modifications can I make to this spinach stew to make it work for me?" And I
Okay.
can speak to that. So actually, quite a number of my clients are coming to me hoping that I can and I do understand a lot of those specific meals. What also sometimes surprises me is though, sometimes I'll get clients from very different cultural backgrounds coming to me and asking me to help them modify their food. And I'm always a bit curious about that. I have quite a number of South Asian clients, for
Okay.
example, who sometimes actually aren't even confident, even though I've done a lot of research, I know a lot about, Indian, Pakistani cuisine, but they'll be like, oh, I'm having chapati, like tortilla. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
I know what that is.
Right.
So, I get both ends of the equation, but
Yeah.
definitely. And I think on the education piece, it's been interesting because Ryerson or TMU is a very diverse school. It's a
Okay.
downtown Toronto school. There's people from all sorts of backgrounds. So I would say because of that, we had a very diverse class. So I definitely felt more being like one of two or three guys in a group of like 400 classmates. That felt more, I think, unique than necessarily being Black because there's tons of Black women that were also in my program.
Okay, so it's
Yeah,
a very female-dominated industry that you're
definitely.
in. Okay,
Definitely.
understood. And so cultural competency is really important in your profession, right?
Absolutely.
Understanding patients are coming from, a cultural background. That's what they know. How do
Mhm.
I work with that?
Right.
Not change it, but work within their comfort zone, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, that's great. Now, I'm curious to hear where you see your business going. Where do you see the field of nutrition and diet, registered dietitians as a whole? Where is your field going over the next few years?
Yeah.
And where would you like to go with your business?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think first of all, when it comes to the broader field of dietitians, I think I think there has been a bigger move towards a lot more entrepreneurship and a
Mhm.
lot more people want to be proactive in their health. So there's a bigger
Yeah.
demand for people looking for professionals who can help them on the lifestyle side. I remember actually TMU invited me both in undergrad and one of their grad classes to actually just give a talk on my journey as an entrepreneur, which
Right.
when I was in school, we didn't have those talks. So I
Okay.
think there's a lot more student interested, and then in the future, a lot more professionals servicing that field, which will be great. Well, I always think there's going to be a need for clinical dietitians in the hospital, working with people who are, really, really sick.
Mhm.
I think prevention is huge in
Got it.
that regard. Um, for myself, I'm definitely currently expanding, which has been really exciting. Hiring people has been a very interesting process.
Okay.
I'm sure maybe you've had to maybe dig through it, or I don't know if you have people helping you out in that domain, but going through interviews, kind of sifting out people who are very competent from like people who are quite odd, and
Yeah.
that factor. I've hired my first dietitian, which has been a very exciting shift to have someone on the team, and I'm currently looking to my main point of expansion right now is actually partnering with gyms
Okay.
in the downtown area and beyond. There's a lot that don't have a formal nutrition service or formal nutrition program.
Yeah.
And they have trainers, and actually, a lot of trainers don't have the time. Like, they'll work out with you for an hour and they'll give you quick advice. Oh, cut your carbs, or stop drinking alcohol, or do this or
Or
that.
they're not allowed to talk about
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, the parameters that they're allowed to talk about are very narrow.
it. Right.
versus if they can outsource and say, hey, you know what, we're working on the training side, I'm confident in this, go and talk to Terence or Terence's team on the nutrition side, and then our goals can align much better. That's definitely my current area of expansion, and reaching out to different gyms and building those partnerships.
And so your company is Peak Performance.
Peak Nutrition.
Sorry, Peak Nutrition.
Yes.
So where can people find your services? You also wrote you have a cookbook that you've written.
Yes.
How can people find you and access your services?
Yeah. The best place is peaknutrition.ca, PEAK, nutrition.ca. That's my website. That's where you can book in directly for free consults, full sessions. You'll see everything that's there. I do have some social media at Terence Nutrition, still building that up now and getting ready to post more in the future. So that's another great area that you can find me and reach
Good.
out.
Are you listed on the BHPN directory as well?
Yes, I am currently listed as well.
Good. Well, that's all exciting, and it sounds like you're scaling the business, which means training people to do what you do, right? Getting other dietitians, getting your team going, collaborating, all of those things. So that's exciting, and it'll be exciting to see where you go over the next few years.
Thank you.
As we wrap up, so, you're a member of BHPN, which, as you know, we focus a lot on helping healthcare professionals with business, entrepreneurship, personal finance. Can you talk about how that would have been helpful for you at a younger age, maybe when you were just getting started, and, why that's important for the organizations like us?
Yeah, for sure. I think the first thing is you don't know what you don't know,
Mhm.
right? I remember my first time, like, even just learning about the marketing side and learning how do I put myself out there and what are the proper channels. I didn't know any of it. I think everyone just says, oh, social media, start an Instagram account. But there are so many other ways to kind of put yourself out there that I had just no idea about. So I think marketing is huge. I think accounting, though I got to take like an accounting 101 sort of basics class, it's one thing to do it in school and like an intro course. It's another thing to kind of keep your own books, have your own numbers, have an idea of how much you're making on different services and making those adjustments. So
where the money's going.
yeah, and exactly where it's going. Because you can think like, oh, wow, I'm investing and I'm making it in this scenario, but my business credit card's also piling up. Like, okay, is there a disconnect there?
Right.
So I think some of the just core marketing and accounting is missing in pretty much every healthcare education because it's not the focus.
Yeah.
And then I think the other part is expanding, because I do know a number of professionals who are quite comfortable setting up an office space, setting up a Zoom call, having conversations and doing what they're confident in doing, whether it's therapists, dietitians, etc. But then taking their business to that next step, hiring an HR, maybe bring on someone to handle the sales part of it, having that bigger vision. I think BHPN for me has been super motivating to see other health professionals do that and speak to that experience and realizing like, okay, yeah, I can do this too. And it's just another skill set that I need to develop.
Exactly. That's great. Well, Terence, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been exciting to hear your story, and you're really early on in your career, so we're excited to see how that grows. Perfect. And hopefully people will reach out to you to kind of access your services, and of course we'll want to have you back in the future to hear about how things are going.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you.